The Blue Jewel.
Chapter 1. Completed. The group had fallen asleep. The half-orc as usual had to perform the first shift of guard, so he curled up on the fire. Agnoruk always preferred to be the first, and none of his teammates opposed this decision. Silently watching the flames dance elegantly to the sound of his thoughts, he took a short sip from the cup, tasting the contents slowly. The taste of bitter tea reminded him of old times, before his first battle, even before he killed for the first time. At that time during the summer nights, his father and he used to go hunting and fishing. Many times they returned empty, and that was strange in such skilled warriors, but they did not put much effort. It was a simple excuse to get lost in the lush forests of their birthplace, Vale Nevado. At night they both sat quietly watching the fire. In late summer and early autumn it shone to one star in particular, Aldebaran, to the west between the two moons. His father then took the opportunity to tell him a legend about that hero with whom Agnoruk used to fall asleep. On a night like this, even if I made an effort I could hear his guttural voice telling the next story. Aldebaran was the chosen one of the gods. He was a mere mortal like the others, but there was something inside him that made him different, the untamed fire of a dragon. The gods never helped him in his exploits, they simply considered him among all their favorite. In time he became a great warrior. His exploits were such that one day the gods raised him to the heavens to fight alongside them in the celestial wars. And he did it so well that as a reward they gave him the gift of immortality and sat next to them. But Aldebaran instead only made two wishes, to return to live among mortals anonymously, and when he was about to die, he wanted to do it by fighting a worthy rival. The gods were pleased by his humility and created a star in his honor that shines with special intensity at the end of summer, which was when Aldebaran passed away. His father always told him this legend every night, until Agnoruk came to memorize it. Later, when he began to travel and met multiple cultures and sages, he heard thousands of legends, but nobody knew the legend of Aldebaran, until he thought it was an invention of his father. The last sip of the cup was down his throat. He shook his head. He certainly wouldn't follow in Aldebaran's footsteps. Surely he would end up like his father, killed in an ambush during the search for a lost treasure that appeared in an old forgotten parchment. He for the moment survived as a small-time mercenary. Immersed in thought, Agnoruk noticed someone patting him on the back. The half-orc was slightly surprised. As a precaution he brought his hand to his sword, but it was Inil, the young woman who had to replace him in the guard. He calmed down, gave up his place next to the fire to sit under the shelter of an old tree. He began to cool down like that he covered himself with his blanket and sleep began to overcome him. Stories for children. He thought just before closing his eyes, if there was one thing he was sure of, it was that one day he would die. Chapter 1. There are those who doubt these facts related here. Their critics say that there is no indication that how great heroes met before, but thanks to the mandate of the Emperor I have succeeded in gathering corroborating evidence the total certainty of this narrative. Except from the book, Heroes of the Black Empire. Author, Key Men. Arras. Duboque's call was urgent. The half-orc did not feel like going, since he more or less suspected what Duboque wanted to communicate to him, nothing good. He came to the door of his superior's office, sighed. Now he would have to accept the consequences of his actions. I decisively knock on the door, 2 forceful knocks. Go ahead. It was a hoarse and firm voice, from someone accustomed to making decisions for a long time. Arras entered Duboque's office. As always with the table full of books, letters, and contracts. He was sick of order and of meticulously recording everything that happened within his company of mercenaries. But not only was Duboque in the office, he was accompanied by the half-elf Loranthas. The issue must be serious. Good afternoon, Arras, please take a seat. Dubok indicated without putting any emphasis on the words with which the half-orc did not know what to expect. Arras took a seat next to the elf, who was looking at him seriously. Both shared the same rank within the mercenary company, captains. There were 2 more captains and a general, Dubok, who did not normally go on a mission in person, used to delegate to one of his 4 captains. Neither Arras nor Loranthus were Dubok's right-hand man, although he had great confidence in both of them. Each captain had enough independence in his command, so it was strange to see the half-elf present at this meeting. Before Arras spoke, Dubok threw a letter that ended up landing on the very edge of the table, with one of its tips pointing to the half-orc. Arras recognized the seal, unmistakable, a black dragon holding with its lower claws a rose to which petals fall. It was the seal of the Black Emperor. "I received this letter yesterday, Arras," commented Dubok with a serious gesture. "I doubt that the Emperor needs our services," replied Arras ironically. Dubok was not amused by the comment, turned in his chair and reached out to reach the letter and open its contents. "According to the Emperor, a month ago you met with a group of rebels, who proposed you to lead an Orca revolt against the Empire." Arras leaned back, was what he suspected. Indeed, he had met discreetly with an Orc delegation. They offered him the command of an insurrection, but Arras did not accept his proposal and recommended that they not try. At the moment the Black Empire was too powerful. "It's true, I declined the offer. I only met with them because of the friendship that bound me to one of the members of the group. The Emperor doesn't care about that. He has threatened to wipe us all out if something like this happens again." Dubok's tone was one of anger, "But that's not the serious thing. The serious thing is that one of my captains meets with a group of rebels and does not inform me of anything. That is insolence." At the end of the sentence Dubok banged on the table vehemently. "Arras, we understand your situation, but remember that you are banished. Any meeting on your part can be considered by the Emperor as an act of treason. The main traitor against the Empire is the Emperor himself." Arras replied firmly. It was true that meeting with the rebels was a risk, but he had not sought it and had also rejected a totally unfeasible plan. Dubok seemed calmer, continuing with a more conciliatory tone. "We all know what happened to your father and your suspicions, but you must be more careful. We are not so far from the Black Empire, and the Emperor has much more influence within Almera than you imagine." Loranthus touched the shoulder of Arras in support mode, who with a quick gesture separated enough. With tolerating someone with elf blood came, he didn't need his condescension. "We think it is convenient that you disappear from the scene for a while," the half-elf told him. "Bye. It's better this way." Dubok didn't feel much like talking. The half-elf continued. "You have to go east, beyond the Sea of Ice. Dubok considers that we must recruit a new mercenary. That's not a captain's mission." Loranthus turned his head and his eyes fell on Dubok. He never thought he would have to act like this with Arras, but he was the one who ran this company for more than 20 years. "It is the mission that I think you should do. The details will be tomorrow. If it is true, half of what they say about that boy will be a great addition to our company." The half-elf smiled mockingly. "You will have a faithful subject, if you were king." Dubok raised his hand so that the half-elf will close his mouth. Arras's look was one of disdain, evidently a punishment. Dubok didn't like receiving threats from anyone, least of all the games behind his back. Arras accepted defeat. "Next time you would have to be more careful or better not meet with anyone." The half-orc got up and left the office without saying goodbye. Alone were Dubok and the half-elf, staring at each other. Someday he will return to the Black Empire if the Emperor does not assassinate him before. Dubok did not reply to Loranthus, simply keeping the Emperor's letter in a locked drawer. "Sometime, but not now. Agnoruk." The young man opened his eyes, tried to get out of bed, but it was impossible since he began to vomit profusely. The smell was disgusting. His insides were burning, nausea was unbearable. Reaching the limit, Agnoruk fell round to the ground. Luckily, the one with whom he shared the bed was in a more pitiful state than his. Seeing that fighting against his current state was a losing fight, the young man decided to stay on the ground for a few moments. He closed his eyes. She felt like her long black hair was soaked by her own vomit. When he opened his eyes again, he had no notion of how long he had been unconscious on the ground. He decided to join again, and making a great effort he succeeded. But now he had a new problem. It was dawn, and the rays of the sun that entered through the window made his eyes burn. With his right hand he tried to protect himself, but it was useless. It was none of his business. He tried to convince himself not to do something stupid. He returned to the door, separated by 2 meters, again a scream, more muffled than the previous one. He stopped, spat on the ground, cursing inwardly. Resigned, he changed direction, drew his sword, and headed toward the place where the screams came from. There were 2 guards guarding the entrance, but they were asleep. He recognized the uniforms. It was the personal guard of the Duke of Kandiva, one of the king's closest collaborators. The night before he appeared at the local last minute. Agnoruk noticed his presence. Unlike his companions who were already too drunk, he should never stop observing the surroundings. As far as he knew, the Duke did not have a good reputation among commoners, but nothing that was not something usual in the nobility. Now it was too late. Without hesitation, Agnoruk opened the door wide. The half-orc didn't like what he found. On the floor lay a young woman beaten to death, and on the bed was another girl with a totally disfigured face. Agnoruk reached out to help the young woman lying on the ground, but there was not much to do for her. While a middle-aged man continued to beat the other young woman viciously. He recognized the aggressor. It was the Duke. The half-orc approached the bed and with a push stopped the nobleman from his miserable action. The Duke did not react very well to this unexpected intrusion. "How dare you enter here, lackey? This harlot has to know who's in charge here. You have no right to dispose of anyone's life on a whim." Agnoruk spat on the ground. This would not end well. In the background I heard how the guard woke up alarmed. Soon they would come to meet him. What the hell? Fuck everything, he thought as he opened his mouth, baring his terrible fangs to the Duke. The half-orc opened his eyes again and vomited again. Now to the recipe of the usual nauseating porridge a new ingredient was added: blood. Fortunately, there was not much light in that cell. Agnoruk was trying to remember what happened, but at the moment everything was very diffuse. Cuando la lucidez empezaba a legal, entraron en la celda dos guardias que como recibimiento le propinaron dos buenas patadas en el estómago. This time he didn't vomit. The recipe was simpler. He just spit out blood. In silence, they carried him in volandas. Then they sat him on a hard wooden chair. Agnoruk recognized the place. It was the court. I had visited it on some other occasion, although not in such a sorry state. The judge was on the stand, his aquiline nose pointed directly into his eyes. His life was worth less than that of an innocent at the entrance of a dragon's den. How does the accused declare? Agnoruk planned to say something brilliant in his defense, but when he was about to open his mouth, the guards gave him a few blows in the face to keep him quiet. I see that you reject your right to defense. Very well. For having amputated the noble parts of the Grand Duke of Cavinda with his mouth and killing much of his personal guard, condemned the Orca. The sentence will be served at dawn. The half-orc tried to remember if what he was sentenced to death for had happened, and yes, it was very likely. Surely the sentence was deserved. He pushed back to the dungeon. What did not seem good to him is that on his last night they did not even give him a measly bowl of water. It was an indecency. The Last Supper is a sacred rite, but at least he could sleep almost acceptably. At dawn he was taken to the scaffold. In the place there was no public, another ugly detail. He had castrated one of the highest nobles in the kingdom, in short a pittance. The executioner greeted him politely and his response was reciprocal, at least someone was educated. They put the rope around his neck, without hardly waiting for the executioner activated the spring that opened the trapdoor. Agnoruk felt his legs float, the rope squeezing his neck and not letting him breathe. He held on until he was knocked unconscious. In order not to lose the habit, again before opening his eyes he vomited again. Such a habit began to be somewhat annoying. As far as he knew about death, in that state he didn't usually vomit, so he was alive and that was totally unexpected. Neutering the closest advisor to King Antartu is not what is said to be a smart decision, commented a voice with a certain mocking air. It's smart when you see what he did to two poor girls. I have to pay a visit to the owner of the place. He sold the poor ones like simple cattle. Agnoruk replied hoarsely, caressing his neck, as he had the mark of the noose raw. Go. What I needed to see, we have here a truham from 3 to a quarter who comes to the aid of prostitutes who are not worth 2 silver coins. Luckily King Antar values a good sum of gold and did not hold the Duke in such high esteem. There were rumors in court that he was plotting to usurp the throne, but who would want a castrated king? It is a worse fate than death. That voice Agnoruk had never heard but still had something familiar. It was the accent, without a doubt, a guttural accent typical of an orc. It reminded him of his father. Agnoruk sat up and looked defiantly at his interlocutor. And you? Who the fuck are you? The young man in front of him smiled and showed fangs that were very familiar to Agnoruk. That young man was a half-orc like him, but not as tall and corpulent. Agnoruk was shocked. He had only seen one member of the White Orcs, his father. It was the first time he had met another member of his tribe. My name is Arras of Arras. You are Prince Arras. Agnoruk, of course, who knew him, was a famous warrior, son of the ill-fated orc general Arras and now banished by the Black Emperor. Next to Arras was a tall, bald, dark-skinned man. He wore a heavy blue wizard's robe. He smiled upon seeing Agnoruk's reaction and spoke cordially. And you are Agnoruk, we have been looking for you for 2 months. Welcome to the company of the Blue Phoenix. Arian. A skinny dog is all fleas, that saying was what she had in mind as she watched her young patient sleep peacefully in bed. The sick woman had improved considerably since the afternoon and was now resting. Arian had a little time to meditate and rest from the hustle and bustle of the past few weeks. Despite the improvement, he couldn't help but stare at his patient, admiring his beautiful hair. With an almost instinctive gesture, he began to observe himself in a nearby mirror. He was worried to see his fatigued face and the unkempt appearance of his hair, and his skin tone was very pale. These were all symptoms of a person who had not rested much in recent weeks. With great care he sat up from the girl's bed and tiptoed towards a window to his left. From there he could observe the mountains inside. Soon it will dawn, he thought, and because of the few clouds that the still starry sky showed, tomorrow would be a clear day where the sun could reign in all its splendor. It was already noticeable that the harsh winter was subsided, and that soon spring would come to help heal the wounds caused by the winter season. His gaze focused on the mirror again, and what he saw again he didn't like very much. In the reflection appeared a young woman wearing a huge skirt of a worn brown color and a whitish blouse that indicated that those clothes had better times. Despite his current emaciated appearance, he still maintained a certain amount of dignity. Arian was far from short, measuring about 1.70 meters tall. He could be compared to most men in the region, although he was in the bones. With the hustle and bustle of the last few weeks, he had not eaten much and the stress had made him lose weight. His face was sharper than usual. I should eat something else. If I continue down this path, I will end up being a specter, he decided mentally. Arian lay down next to his patient again. The little girl had a bed that was too spacious and too tempting for someone who hadn't slept in a decent way for the past 20 days. Despite his lack of sleep, as soon as he went to bed he realized he couldn't keep an eye on it. There was so much accumulated tension that sleep seemed unnecessary. Now he had the tranquility and time to sort out his thoughts. Which was not an easy task, especially since the memories were piling up without order. Whenever things go wrong, one thinks that the past times were better, but there was also the addition that in his head he had a question that was difficult to answer. Since when did things start to go wrong? The truth, he had to make a great effort to answer it, since things did not go well for a long time. The young woman searched her memories for some pleasant moment that had happened to her lately. The closest in time that came to her mind was the happy face of her brother Nilam laughing next to her before she left for the south. It was at the beginning of last summer. Nilam was preparing to travel south, far away from Caesarea. Their destination was the city of Tripulia, located in the great kingdom of Olbiana. Crew called the City of Magic, since it is there where the headquarters of the most powerful orders of magic from around the world reside. Nilam traveled to receive the education necessary to become a great magician. Traveling south was not his brother's idea, but his master Loaf, the one-eyed, as he believed that Nilam had a serious chance of becoming one of the best magicians in the region. Loaf was not only the teacher of both brothers, but was also their adoptive father, since the parents of Nilam and Arian died when they were 2 children, and having no direct relatives to take care of them, was Loaf who was responsible for their care. The old man had raised them all these years, and in Caesarea everyone knew him by the nickname of El Tueto, because he had a glass eye that he often hid under a patch. Loaf was the magician of Caesarea. He had arrived from the south about 5 years before the birth of both brothers, and had settled in to live quietly his last days, as he himself had recognized many times. But his healing gifts and magical abilities were soon discovered and used by the inhabitants of Caesarea. Those who were grateful for his services decided to reward him, so the council of the Caesarea, at popular request, decided to give him an abandoned house on the outskirts of the city and provide him with the necessary food for his maintenance in exchange for being something like the doctor of the community, something that Loaf gladly accepted. But not only did he work as a magician and healer, Loaf was a person who had traveled a lot and who possessed a vast culture, which made him a man versed in many subjects in which to advise the people of Caesarea. Loaf's life was a mystery. What little Arian knew was that his teacher had studied in Cruia but had not reached the level of other fellow students such as Ferdinand de Bussy, who now presides over the Great Council of Magic Orders. Loaf had studied with Ferdinand himself, although over time he saw that his level was much lower than that of his famous friend, and became one of the many adventurers who travel Shanaris in search of fortune. In one of his most exciting adventures was where he lost his right eye as a miserable green troll ripped it from the socket in the course of a bloody fight and had no choice but to replace it with a glass eye. The old wizard not only raised them but also began to teach them some of his acquired knowledge. What began as a mere diversion to entertain themselves during the long winter days was turning into something more serious. As his 2 students progressed in their teachings, Loaf realized that they both had quite a few skills for magic and healing. Nilam excelled above all in the magical arts, and Arian, on the contrary, was a student with a natural talent when it comes to using medicinal plants, and also possessed great healing gifts innately. As time passed, as Arian recalled with a slight smile on his face, they became as skilled as their teacher. Loaf always told them that it was a shame to waste so much talent in this small corner of the world. It was necessary, in order not to stagnate its evolution, to travel to other places in order to acquire more experience and knowledge. One day Loaf proposed to the council of citizens of Caesarea the necessity of sending his 2 pupils to the south, to Tripulia, to receive the training of the best teachers and scholars. The council accepted Loaf's proposal, but only had enough funds to send one of the magician's students. Arian then remembered Not without some misgivings, as Loaf did not hesitate for a second. He chose his brother Nilam to go to Tripulia. Loaf comforted Arian by telling him, "It's more important for your brother to continue with magic studies. Your skills are great enough to take care of your people here. You don't need to learn more." As expected, the news caused a stir throughout Caesarea, and on the eve of Nilam's departure a big party was organized in his honor. Many inhabitants gave gifts to Nilam, from clothes made with wool to a wonderful case of whalebone, which was given to him by the fishermen of the area, to store the scrolls that he would undoubtedly need to learn in the Magic Academy. After a great banquet was held after the delivery of presents, the whole town participated in the party, dancing and laughing with music and fire. Arian was happy for his brother. He would become a great magician, and one day he would return to her and tell her the wonders of the world. They ate, danced and laughed until late at night. But she still remembered something else about that night, something that curiously she had not paid attention to until then and that now seemed important to her. At the end of the party, the three returned to their small house located on the outskirts of Caesarea. Arian went to bed the first as she was exhausted from the party, but the two men stayed for a while smoking with their pipes in the dim light of the fireplace. In principle, she used to have an easy sleep. Her brother used to say that when he slept he could pass an army of 1,000 drunken orcs by his side that would not wake up. But that night he had surely been awakened by the party, with which his attention was directed towards the two smokers, since from his bed he could see and hear perfectly, both talking about the trip to Tripulia, and who Nilam should see in the city to enter one of the many orders of magic that were located there. "Do you have the letter that I have written and that you must deliver to Ferdinand?" "Yes, master," Nilam replied with a certain submissive air. "Well, when you arrive in Tripulia, ask for the Order of the Magi of Eternal Light. Ferdinand is the Grand Master of the Order. He is also the one who presides over the Great Council that directs the destinies of Tripulia. He is someone very influential in Tripulia. With this letter I have no doubt that you will enter an order of magic of the city. Ferdinand is a very good friend of mine." There was a pause. When Loaf spoke again, he did so with a sorrowful tone. "But we have a problem. How much gold has the council given you?" 100 gold coins and some jewelry." "Miserly, damn fisherman, always so sullen. Listen to me, this other letter is for Bipedi El Gordo. You will find him in the Rio Divino. He is also a friend of mine, and when you read this letter you have no doubt that he will hire you and you will have a job with which to pay you the maintenance in Tripulia." "But 100 gold coins are not enough," asked Nilam incredulously. For the young man that amount was a fortune. "That amount is the minimum you need to be accepted into one of the city's magic orders, but you need to eat and Bipedi owes me some favor. You will work hard, but you will have food and a bed." Loaf looked around suspiciously and again paused and used a very stealthy tone as if he feared that someone would spy on him. "I also have something that you should only use in case you are in a very serious emergency for your studies or your life. It is something that will get you out of a hurry, but remember it is something you should use as a last resort." From one of the pockets of Loaf's magician's robe appeared a small black leather bag, from which he took out a small fully spherical jewel of a blue color. The jewel emitted a beam of blue light that dazzled Arian. That light flooded the entire room, and that Loaf only showed it for a second since he quickly put it back in the small leather bag from which he had taken it. "Take this jewel, store it well and use it only in case of emergency." "But master, this is worth more than the whole village. Where did you get it?" Nilam spoke while his eyes could not separate from the bag where the jewel was kept. The old wizard smiled. He took a puff of his pipe before answering the question. "Son, in my adventures the only thing I really got was this glass eye." Loaf couldn't suppress a wry smile as he said the above words. "The jewel you have in your possession is not mine. I found it here in Caesarea, in the abandoned temple behind the mountain, where we sometimes go to look for medicinal plants. In those ruins was the jewel." Nilam asked as he fiddled with the velvet bag. Yes, Nilam, long ago those ruins were a great temple. An important place, kings, princes, merchants, magicians, but also poor and sick, disinherited. Everyone came here, it was a sacred place. Why did they come here? Nilam asked while keeping inside his robe the gift of his master. To recover the only thing that is important and that cannot be insured with money, health. That jewel is surely a donation from one of those powerful lords for his healing. Interesting. Just one more question, Master. To whom was this temple dedicated? Loaf's face changed. His gesture now was one of fear. It was as if he was about to desecrate something sacred. The wizard kept silent and stealthily put out the fire in the fireplace, and also extinguished his pipe. Then he approached his disciple and spoke in such a low tone that the young woman found it difficult to hear what he was saying to Nilam. A god who revealed himself under the orders of the supreme god, his father, and was therefore condemned to oblivion and to wander among men for all eternity. Ilaban. Loaf paused, got up and looked towards where Arian was lying, to make sure the young woman was asleep. Arian pretended in a rather believable manner and Loaf continued by not detecting his protégé's deception. Listen to me, neither your sister nor anyone from Caesarea should be told that you have this jewel. It is a gift for you, forget this conversation and that you have the jewel and only use it when it is totally necessary. Loaf yawned and stretched out his arms, before speaking again. Come on, it's time to go to bed, tomorrow begins a very hard journey. Yes, Master. Early the next morning Loaf and Arian said goodbye to Nilam, who set sail on one of the ships of the few merchants who were engaged in trade in the area. Only the two of them said goodbye to him, the rest of Caesarea was still sleeping, hungover from the big party the night before. Days passed and tranquility reigned in Caesarea. Soon, as one who does not want the thing, a year passed since Nilam had undertaken his journey to the south. Arian gradually assumed more prominence in the activities that Loaf usually exercised, since he also gradually began to absent himself from the population in a more habitual way. The excuses for his travels were increasingly vague and imprecise. His stays in Caesarea became very short, until one grey day, just as autumn began, the magician told Arian that he had to go south to attend to an old friend, but not to worry since he would return before the next change of moons. Since that day Loaf had not returned to the village and almost 6 changes of moons had passed since his last stay with her in Caesarea. Autumn passed and winter was spatially hard with a great storm of cold and snow that forced to moor the fishing boats throughout the winter. To make matters worse, the wolves made an appearance, killing many heads of cattle that the few ranchers who lived in Caesarea had. Although the worst was yet to come. The weather had hardly improved and the boats began to go fishing, when the plague appeared that since then ravages the inhabitants of the town. Arian devoted himself body and soul to the care of the sick. She felt totally helpless since when one of those affected by the strange disease barely improved, 2 or 3 more fell ill. Although it was not the most serious of this ailment. The patients who recovered, within a week, mysteriously suffered the same symptoms as before, but in a more virulent way. And this was the case I was taking care of tonight. The girl had fallen ill 2 days ago when she had barely recovered a week ago. Unfortunately, his mother had not resisted the relapse of the disease and died 5 days ago. Leaving the little girl alone, that's why Arian took care of her with special affection, since he could not help but see in the girl his image of when she was little and her parents died, leaving her and her brother alone. Arian was remembering the last year of his life while his patients slept peacefully thanks to the infusion of the leaves of the flower of the elves, which was the only remedy that the young woman had proven as a safe treatment against the disease, since although it did not cure it, it prevented the symptoms from occurring with all their virulence. Ori, what do you think? Asked the girl. Arian, who was absorbed in her thoughts, had not noticed that the girl had been awake watching her for some time. "Oh, Liana!" Arian was a little embarrassed, as she had completely neglected her patient. "I wasn't thinking about anything particular, I was just remembering my brother. Nilam, I liked the magic tricks he did when we celebrated a party. I remember how he took the coins out of your ears or made a pig covered with a cloth disappear from between his hands." The girl smiled, and so did Arian. Both remembered those tricks that her brother always performed with tremendous ease and that were the sensation among the little ones. But that also surprised the adults who secretly observed the performance of the young wizard's apprentice. "Yes, but he went south to study to become a great magician. Someday Liana will return and the pigs will no longer disappear." "No?" The little girl showed a look of disappointment on her face. "No, he will come and make a huge dragon appear that will tickle you as you misbehave." The young woman began to tickle the girl who defended herself by also tickling her attacker. The assault between the two contenders seemed to end in draws, as both ended up stretched out in bed huffing from the effort of the battle. "Arian, you know I'm better, I don't have a fever." "Yes, but you didn't have it 2 days ago either and you got sick again, so keep a bed." "Like Mom?" "But she died, will I die too?" The death of Liana's mother had been a blow to everyone. "No, I will take care of you, I promise you." He gave the girl a kiss on the cheek to reassure her. When he got his patient back to sleep, knocks rang out at the door of the house. Arian woke up alarmed, as it would surely be an emergency for some sick person whose situation had worsened at night. He looked out the window and realized that it was already dawn. Arian opened the door quickly at the insistence of the knocks. The young woman could not help but show a mixture of surprise and disappointment because she was not affected by the plague claiming her help, but it was Arras, a member of the town council, the governing body of Caesarea. Arras was not very old, barely 40 years old, but the hard life of the sea had tanned his face and his beard made him look older. "Good morning, Arian, the council wants to see you urgently, join me." Arras was a man sparing in words and did not usually leave margin. "When I told you something, it was best to do it." The young woman had a hard time reacting to Arras' request. He had many doubts about the reason for the council meeting, but there was only one way to find out, by accepting Arras' invitation. "Yes, wait for me to take something to keep me warm and I will accompany you." He went to the kitchen of the house where his coat, made of bear skin, was. The garment was a gift from Loaf. The magician had bought it from nomads who lived in the interior, between the mountains and forests, and who in the summer came to Caesarea to sell skins, bone and smoked meat obtained during the year, in exchange for provisions such as salted or smoked fish. Arian closed the door carefully so as not to wake Liana and followed Arras as fast as he could through the alleys of the town. Most were paved but covered with mud as a result of the many rains that had fallen throughout the week, since today was the first sunny day of the whole new year. During the last months the weather had only rewarded them with rain, wind, and snow. After 5 minutes they arrived at the main square where the seat of the council was. It was the largest building in Caesarea. Once it had been a watchtower, but it was abandoned long ago, and having a large room, it was adopted by the inhabitants of the place as the seat of the council. Arras opened the large door that was the entrance to the only room of the building, a huge room where the members of the council sat and that allowed to gather all the inhabitants of Caesarea when an assembly was held. Although on this occasion there were only 9 members, counting Arras of the 19 that made up the council, since many were affected by the plague and lay convalescing. In the middle of the room were the remaining 8 members gathered, except Arras, who remained by Arian's side. Seated at the large elongated table that presided over the room and which had 19 chairs, 1 for each member of the council. The councillors were talking to each other when their gazes focused on the young woman and there was silence in the great room. Most of the council was not amused by Loaf's absence in these difficult times. For them, Arian, although willful, was not able to face the plague alone. "Welcome, dear Arian. I greet you effusively," Mertani, who chairs the council and thus broke the uncomfortable silence in the room. Mertani hurried to the entrance where Arian was to hug her effusively. Mertani was one of the most powerful characters in Caesarea, since he presides over the town council, but was also quite rich. He owned the 4 largest fishing boats in Caesarea. Mertani knew Arian well. Arian's father was the captain of the favorite ship he owned by the council president. Arian's father to Mertani had been like a brother, but then the terrible misfortune of the shipwreck of that great ship occurred with Arian's parents on board. It was a disaster for Mertani and for all of Caesarea, as everyone had at least one relative or acquaintance who were victims of the shipwreck. No wonder the Mertani ship disaster was one of the saddest events in Caesarea's recent history. Mertani, given the close relationship with Arian's parents, was about to shelter the 2 orphans, and perhaps it would have been the most logical, but seeing that Loaf took care of them. The president of the council remained in the background, but helped the 2 brothers in an indirect way by paying for the maintenance of the 2 little ones. But even so, Mertani maintained a close relationship with the 2 children, and they had spent quite a bit of time with the family of the president of the council, especially playing with their children. Arian in Mertani's house was treated in a special way. All of Mertani's children were boys, and both he and his wife longed for a daughter, so Arian was always constantly spoiled at home. Arian grew up and so did Mertani's children, so the couple decided that it was in everyone's best interest for Arian to marry their eldest son Phidias. Perhaps because of this desire of the Mertani family, the head of the family was quite vehemently opposed to the young woman leaving Caesarea with her brother. Almost all the funds for his brother's trip came from the Mertani coffers, and it was well known that if they wanted they could donate the amount necessary to finance the trip of the 2 brothers. This decision caused Arian to cool his relationship with the Mertani and Phidias. He blamed his imprisonment in Caesarea on both them and Loaf. But despite these small frictions, both parties had a cordial relationship. Mertani maintained the hope that in the future, sooner or later, Arian would reconsider and agree to marry Phidias. The young woman also couldn't get along with the most powerful person in Caesarea. Mertani's desire that Arian be his future daughter-in-law caused that the absence of Loaf did not make him very funny. It was the old wizard who had to take care of the duties with the community and leave the young woman with more free time to worry about her future. Of course, both Mertani and his son had already decided that after the wedding Arian would stop helping Loaf in his obligations and would only dedicate himself to his work in the house. And if Loaf did not take care of his duties towards the inhabitants of Caesarea, both Mertani and his son would look for another who would take care of them. Despite these frictions, Mertani maintained a cheerful expression before the young woman. Nothing seemed to indicate tension on her face, except for the uncomfortable silence in the room and the extreme seriousness of the other members of the council. Mertani took a seat in the center of the table, in the place reserved for the president of the council. Arian walked towards them slowly. Mertani's expression changed, from one cheerful to one serious, almost sad. "How many new patients have appeared in recent days?" 12 more. Huram and his wife Linara fell last night, although with mild symptoms. "I hope they recover soon," replied Arian seriously. "And tell me, in total, how many sick people there are in all Caesarea?" "I don't know the exact number, but they must exceed 100 right now. Of these, only 2 people have died, the elderly Hyora and Leana's mother Sue." Mertani and the council remained silent. It was evident that they knew more than enough about the number of deaths produced by the plague, but what they wanted was to know what Arian knew about the situation. The council president rose from his chair, then stroked his grey beard as he circled around the room thinking what he had to say. In silence he advanced until he ran into the thick granite wall, To avoid the shock he turned completely. He walked again until he reached the height of Arian. More than 100 out of a population of about 500 people. It was a worrying fact without a doubt. He turned on himself and looked at the young woman again, this time sticking his big blue eyes on her. Do you know what situation this is? Arian remained silent. The young woman wondered if Matani was also affected by the plague and that made her suffer from paranoia. Matani appeared to regain his composure before speaking back to the room. You are too young to know how plagues begin. At first there are only a few affected who recover quickly, but with the passage of time they are increasingly sick and with stronger symptoms until, as happened to Liena's mother, you die. The situation is serious, Arian, and we must do something. We all know the story of the plague of death that happened more than 30 years ago, but this is not the same. At the moment only Hyora and Sue have died. Both were women of very fragile health. I don't think they can be compared to what happened in the past. Think. We are not in a position to believe, we need help, and also you alone cannot against the plague that hangs over us. Matani showed some hatred towards Arian. Help? Whose? For Arian it was a totally new idea. They had never needed to seek help from abroad since she could remember. It doesn't matter who, someone. That is why we have called you, to inform you that a group headed by my son Phidias has already left to go south, towards the ports of Zira and Huron. They will look for priests, magicians, clergy, healers, anyone who offers to help us fight this threat. Then you relieve me and also Loaf. Arian's tone was grief-stricken with tears in his eyes. No, my dear, you are very valid and we all know what you can, but alone you are not capable. Besides, do you plan to spend your whole life healing fishermen and farmers? You should think about your future now that you're young, but it's up to you. He paused, but everyone in the room knew what Matani meant. As for Loaf, nobody knows where he is, you don't know either. Even if he returns, the fact is that Loaf is very old and it may be that some mishap happened to him during his last trip. In any case, sooner rather than later it will be withdrawn and we must find someone to turn to in cases of emergency. If you find someone, then will that person replace me? I don't like to call it that. Who has to be replaced is Loaf, since I remind you that you are a simple helper. Of course you can help whoever asks you, but we believe that we must find someone with more experience. If the expedition is successful and we find help, maybe some of those people want to stay in Caesarea, we will be happy, and if that person agrees you could be his assistant just as you were from Loaf. When Matani finished saying that, the rest of the council rose and left the room, implying that the meeting was over. Arian was still standing with a serious expression, staring at Matani. The young woman had managed to suppress tears but was waiting for a convincing response for Loaf's dismissal. Matani seemed to understand the young woman and spoke to her with an affable gesture, just as when she was a child. We just have to tell you, and surely you will be very busy. You can leave. Why are you doing this to me, Matani? Now that they were alone, the young woman was able to cry. The president of the council did not say anything more. He only approached the height of the young woman and stroked her hair while she cried and then disappeared. There was only her and Arras at the door, waiting impatiently for the young woman to come out. Arian regained his spirits, raised his head. The sun began to take height and entered through the skylights that were at the top, illuminating magnificently the interior. Nothing could be done to him. He regained his dignity and walked out of the tower.